Good morning and welcome to Mosaic. I am Pastor Elizabeth Eckdale. I serve at St. Mark's Lutheran Church here in San Francisco. Welcome and good morning to you on this Sunday. And I'm delighted to have a guest with us today, Dr. David Hollinger. Welcome. You are the Preston Hotchkiss Professor Emeritus from UC Berkeley. We welcome you to Mosaic this morning. You have a lot to share with us about
Thank you.
American Protestantism, but you're also a history professor, or you were.
That's correct.
An area. So we'll hear more about that. You're also affiliated with the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. You're a faculty affiliate there. So
that's right.
Tell us what you did at UC Berkeley, your area of history, and then this center.
Well, I taught U.S. history at UC Berkeley for about 25 years.
Yeah.
I'm retired now, but one of the projects that I had was to try and advance the academic study of religion on the campus, which had been a sort of hit and miss operation.
Right.
So a group of us thought that we ought to do something about this. And so we got some big grants, and we now have this Berkeley Center, which works well. It's very pluralistic, so we study all kinds of religions, and it's open for secular as well as faith commitment discussions. We like to say sometime that the motto of our center is that religion is too important to be left in the hands of people who believe in it. So there's a variety of voices that are part of our discussion.
And your specific focus there?
Yeah, the contribution that I've tried to make, and I'm not the only one that does this, is the study of American Protestantism.
Okay.
So I've been writing about that for the last few years, and so I've been incorporated in a number of their projects, and I'm convening a workshop of bringing in about 24 younger scholars from around the country to discuss the history of Protestantism later this year, which is one of the several things that we do at the center.
Wonderful, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute, talk about American Protestantism on the Mosaic Show. Welcome back to Mosaic. I'm Elizabeth Eckdale at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, and with me today is Dr. David Hollinger from the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and his area of focus is American Protestantism, but particularly in the last 100 years. So
Right.
help us understand what have been the changes in American Protestantism, but your focus with this topic.
I try to get people to understand that the best approach to American Protestantism over the last 100 years or so is to think of it as a two-party system. Sort of like when we talk about American politics, we've got Republicans and Democrats, and well, they are understood to be part of the same enterprise, but rivals. And from time to time, they develop very different outlooks on things. When we talk about Protestantism, we also have a two-party system, but the vocabulary for identifying it is a little bit more complicated. Mm-hmm. When we talk about the two-party system in politics, we know what a Republican is, and we know what a Democrat is. Whereas the two-party system in Protestantism, the terms we now use the most often are evangelical and ecumenical. But the earlier versions of this would be fundamentalist and modernist, and earlier liberal versus conservative. So right now, we have a lot of attention to evangelical Protestants in the United States and less attention to ecumenical Protestants.
And how would you define those words?
An ecumenical Protestant is somebody who takes a less literal outlook on Scripture. An evangelical, part of the fundamentalist tradition, is more literal, and they talk about inerrancy, that the Bible says what it means and it means what it says. Mm-hmm. Liberals, ecumenicals, are more inclined to see room for interpretation and to see the growth of Christianity, the growth of Protestantism over time as reflecting new wisdom as to how to apply it. Whereas the evangelicals are firmer on what they would call orthodoxy. They want to stick with something that's tried and true, the faith of the fathers and all of that. So there's a greater flexibility and openness. Also the ecumenicals, and this is where the term comes from, ecumenicals are big on cooperating with other people, with other Protestants, other Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus. So the ecumenical approach is more capacious, whereas the evangelical approach is to sort of stick with the home truths, stay with the old faith, and be aware of the acids of modernity. I might mention also, Elizabeth, that a vocabulary complexity of this is that the term mainline
Yes.
is often used
Right.
to talk about the people I'm calling ecumenical Protestants. And the reason that's deceptive is that nowadays it's the evangelicals that are more mainline in that they have much more media attention. They have much stronger political lobby. So when the press talks about Protestantism today, it's almost always evangelical Protestantism.
That's what people think of.
That's right. So the mainline, but mainline was a term that caught on for what I'm calling the ecumenical Protestants back in the 60s. And the reason it caught on was because the class position of the ecumenicals was so much stronger. So ecumenical Protestants were stakeholders in national institutions. They were prominent in corporations, in foundations, in the Congress, in the Senate. And, you know, as of 1960, if you in the United States were in a position to lead an institution, to have some influence over the direction of it, in as late as 1960, you were likely, I mean, there are many exceptions to this, but you were likely to be at least nominally affiliated with one of the classic mainline ecumenical denominations, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Northern Baptists, Quakers, Episcopalians, whereas on the other side, you know, the people that felt left out in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but are now very prominent, Church of the Nazarene, Southern Baptist, Christian Missionary Alliance, Seventh-day Adventist. So there is a two-party system of these two different clusters.
Yes.
They have different centers of gravity, and they don't much like each other, actually, and they try to work out what their relationship is.
Well, I was just going to ask you, what is the relationship between these two parties, so to speak, right now?
Well, right now, it's, I think, more hostile than ever, because the ecumenical mainline Protestants, who've been pretty quiet for a while, have come out during the last year or so and are really critical of the evangelicals for being so close to Trump and being so tied to the Republican Party.
So it's connected with the political
very
climate.
Definitely. Now, there are other foundations for this. The ecumenical Protestants are much better educated, by and large, than the evangelical Protestants. That's not as sharp a difference as it was, say, 50 or 60 years ago. So there's a difference there. But the big thing right now, to answer your question directly, Elizabeth, is politics.
Yeah.
So there have been several columns recently by leading ecumenical Protestants. Randall Balmer is a very prominent Episcopalian from Dartmouth College. He wrote a column in the Times the other day really excoriating the President's Advisory Council, where there are 25 evangelical leaders, only one of whom has resigned so far out of protest of the way that President Trump is behaving. So that's an example of where there's real conflict, deep disagreement among people who see themselves as part of the large community of faith. But it's a real fight.
Do you have any examples of where these two parties are working together? Where they're cooperating together?
Yes. They are working together on the environment. They are working together on the diminution of poverty.
Yes.
But I hasten to explain that only some are working together, because in the evangelical group, you have somebody like Jim Wallace, who identifies himself as an evangelical.
From Sojourners.
That's right. So he wants to cooperate with the ecumenical Protestants. But there are other groups within the evangelical party that are very suspicious of that, and that they think that if you spend too much time talking about racial inequality, economic inequality, the problems of the environment, if you spend too much time talking about that, you're going to lose track of what really matters. What really matters? Abortion, same-sex marriage, things like that. So there are quarrels about that. So there's a disagreement.
With those divisions, we're going to come back in just a moment, see what else unites the Protestants together, and look at their missionary experiences in the last 100 years. Welcome again to Mosaic. Welcome back to Mosaic. With me is Dr. David Hollinger. Today we're talking about American Protestantism, and one of the things we want to talk about is the whole missionary experience of our Protestant churches and denominations in the last 50, even really 100 years. And some of your most recent research has been focused on the missionary experience. So tell us about that.
I'm glad you give a chance to talk about that, because the missionary experience was such a big deal for American Protestants in 1910, 1940 even, down through the 1950s. Now there's not as much attention to it, except among the evangelicals, and they still have a robust missionary project abroad. The liberals, the ecumenical Protestants, the mainline Protestants, gradually pulled back from their missionary project and moved more into service activities. But the experience of the two groups abroad turned out to have very deep effects on the whole course of American Protestant history. Because what happens is that the liberal Protestants, generally being a lot better educated than the evangelical Protestants and more liberal theologically, when they go abroad in 1910, 1920, 1925, they are much more responsive to indigenous cultures and to the societies that they encounter abroad. And they're influenced by this. So one after another of these Lutheran, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Methodist missionaries, they come back to the United States and they say, wait a minute, turning all these Hindus and Muslims into copies of the kind of Christians that we have here in Dallas or Chicago or Boston or wherever, that's not necessarily such a good thing.
Right.
These people have their own societies, and we Americans can help them. We can be partners with them. But we ought to move back from this whole idea of trying to turn them into copies of us. So they then become more ecumenical. A while ago, you and I were talking, Elizabeth, about this difference between a greater cooperation and about how the liberals want to cooperate with a whole variety of peoples. Well, that's not the way it affected the evangelicals. The evangelicals generally felt that the experience with the heathens reinforced the particularity of their faith.
That's
and they
what
were all the more determined.
They saw them as heathens,
That's right.
of course.
Whereas the liberals, who were educated more broadly and were more responsive to what they found in the field, they come back to the United States and they go into their various churches and to their denominational meetings and to their public forums. And they say, wait a minute, we need to do something differently. And our society is too provincial. So many of the liberal Protestant missionaries become cosmopolitan. They become enemies of American provincialism. So they take one American institution, one American practice after another, and they say, wait a minute, this is too narrow. And it got them in a good bit of trouble with a lot of the people in the pew. So you can imagine, you come into a church in Terre Haute, Indiana, and you're talking about what's going on in China. And some pious soul gets up and says, we did not send you to China to come back here to Indiana and tell us how interesting the Chinese are. So there are troubles that the missionaries have to work very hard to educate the people in their faith communities as to what they're going. Now, what happens then, and this is a crucial fact about what happens to liberal Protestantism in the United States, is that the leadership of the ecumenical denominations gets more and more cosmopolitan. They think more and more globally, whereas the people in a lot of their congregations are still thinking locally. They're not thinking globally.
That's right.
So you have this tension between a cosmopolitan leadership and a more provincial base.
Right, because those congregations get very attached to their missionary wherever they are, and they want that work to be done.
They do.
But the whole then kind of missionary movement begins to critique itself, it sounds like.
Well, it does, because one of the complaints that these liberal missionaries have, they come back and they say that we need a whole different approach to foreign peoples. And they get into really serious arguments with the evangelicals. That's why this matter of the two-party system always needs to be kept in mind. These two groups constantly define themselves in relation to one another. So the kind of liberal Protestant missionaries that I'm talking about, they're going to national meetings, writing in the Christian Century and other magazines about their views. The evangelicals hit the ceiling. So they're heresy trials. They're efforts to throw these people out,
Yep.
efforts to condemn them. And many of the evangelical organizations that are established in the 1940s and 50s, like Fuller Theological Seminary,
Yeah.
the magazine Christianity Today, the organization, the National Association of Evangelicals, these are founded partly to contest the liberal ecumenists pulling away from the classic missionary project.
Yeah.
So you have this constant back and forth, and you have amongst the evangelicals a sort of separate institution building.
The other important point that you've mentioned earlier is that these missionaries themselves come back and they start to change the political climate in life.
They do.
In politics in the U.S. So say a brief word, important word about that.
Yeah, this is something else that gets them into a lot of trouble with the evangelicals, because they're very far out on racial equality. If you look, say, at the period before about 1960, relatively few Anglo-Protestants were strongly involved in the African-American civil rights movement. Relatively few Anglo-Protestants. The Anglo-Protestants that were involved as allies of Martin Luther King and people like that were overwhelmingly of missionary background. And the more that these liberal Protestants got allied with the civil rights movement, the more the evangelicals say, oh, you're meddling with politics. Stick with the gospel.
Yes.
We need to change people's hearts first.
Yes.
Billy Graham used to say that. Change people's hearts. And the liberals say, that's not enough. Got to change the laws.
That's right.
Change the institutions. So that was an example of where American politics was very much affected by the liberal Protestants.
And you've talked more about also other areas of American life, foreign service, for example, and other areas. But we're going to have to come back to those influences in just a minute or so. Here on Mosaic, we'll be back. Welcome back to Mosaic. We're with Dr. David Hollinger this morning. One of the books he's written is After Cloven Tongues of Fire. It's about modern liberalism, modern liberal Protestantism in American history. We're talking specifically now about kind of the missionaries of these denominations, of these two parties, and how they've influenced so much U.S. society. We were about to talk about the influence of foreign service and foreign policy. These are the missionary movement, the missionaries who are now affecting our political climate and decisions.
It may be that the most important single consequence of the liberal ecumenical missionary project abroad was the creation in the United States during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and after, of a substantial number of people who believed that the foreign policy of the United States should be oriented to the self-defined interests of non-white decolonizing peoples. So the missionaries who'd spent time in India and Africa and the Middle East, they come back and they say, American foreign policy is too oriented to the old colonial powers.
Yes.
And we are using the Cold War, for example, as a context for being against Arab nationalists, for being against nationalists in Southeast Asia. So the people who come out of the missionary project and who advance these views, they do so partly in the public domain, in writing op-ed pages and in resolutions for their churches. But they also express it in the Foreign Service, in the CIA, in the State Department.
How did they get influenced?
The way this works is that when World War II comes along, the government of the United States doesn't have very many people who are really fluent in foreign languages and who are deeply knowledgeable about what goes on in these societies. So the government sort of very quickly in 1941 and 1942 looks around for people who know about this. And they find all these missionaries and the children of missionaries. And these people are fluent in Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, Vietnamese, all the different languages that are suddenly important strategically. So they get into government. And when they're there, they have all these quarrels because the establishment in the State Department and in much of the Foreign Service thinks of American foreign policy in relation to our European allies. So one of the guys that I study, and I just have completed a book exactly on this called Protestants Abroad, How Missionaries Tried to Change the World but Changed the United States, also published by my publisher Princeton that you mentioned a while ago. This book is heavily about a number of individuals in the government who try to change American foreign policy but generally fail. They generally fail. Like there's this one guy who was a former missionary to Thailand. He's brought into the government right away in 1941 because Roosevelt and his Joint Chiefs of Staff don't have anybody who knows about Southeast Asia. So this guy immediately goes into war, basically, against the other State Department guys on what American foreign policy should be. And he says, you guys are too closely allied with the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Dutch Empire. He says, this missionary guy, his name's Kenneth Landon, he says, what we need is an alliance with these indigenous people. And he fights this all the way through the war. And one of the most interesting things that he does, this guy is the author of the document of earliest date in the Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, this great compendium, all these documents about how the United States got foolishly involved in Vietnam. Okay, this guy is the author of the earliest document, which is 1946, and what it's based on is 10 days of conversations he has with Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi, because he's there in Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh loves him, and he likes Ho Chi Minh a lot. So they developed this idea that the United States maybe should take over Vietnam as a protectorate to protect it from the Chinese and the Russians, sort of like the United States had the Philippines as a protectorate and then was in the process of giving it independence.
Dr. Hollinger, what's motivating these missionaries to move the United States in this direction? Is it their faith? Is it their patriotism? What is it?
The basic background to it, the sort of starting point for that, is classic Christian universalism.
Yeah.
I mean, these people took the Sermon on the Mount seriously. So they believed in the radical equality of all human souls. So Galatians 3:28, in Christ there is no male or female, no slave nor free.
Greek or Joe.
That's right. So they take this stuff. Yeah. So, and you know, the scriptures, well, you can sort of take what you want and do with it, but they went with that.
And we're going to have to leave it there and encourage people to read this wonderful book, to hear more about these stories and how they changed America. Protestants Abroad by Dr. David Hollinger. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful guest, and appreciated your being here on Mosaic. Thank you to Reverend Ron Swisher, my co-host, and our beloved producer, Hugh Burrows. This is Mosaic. Welcome.